My name is Cassidy Wynn. I am a 29-year-old captain and logistics officer currently stationed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. And the day my father, James Wynn, was lowered into the frozen earth of Westchester County, I realized that to my family, I was nothing more than a clerical error in a billion-dollar ledger. My father was a man who measured love in square footage and calculated affection based on annual returns, a real estate mogul who turned Manhattan into his personal chessboard. And even in death he managed to make us feel like pawns. The air inside the private conference suite at the Grand Hyatt New York was heavy with the suffocating scent of Casablanca lilies and the sharp, acidic tang of $4 a cup hotel coffee that tasted like burnt coins. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, my spine locked in a rigid military salute to a man who never understood why I traded a potential partnership at a white-shoe law firm for a pair of sand-dusted combat boots and a commission in the United States Air Force. My sister, Leona, who is 34 and a senior litigation partner at one of the most aggressive firms in Midtown, didn't even acknowledge my presence as she adjusted her $3,000 Max Mara wool blazer. To her, I was the dropout, the disappointment who walked away from a full ride at Columbia Law to manage supply chains in a war zone. She sat at the polished mahogany table, her 2024 MacBook Pro open and humming, her fingers tapping against the aluminum chassis with the precision of a metronome. She treated this gathering not as a mourning of our father's 72 years of life, but as a hostile corporate takeover, a quarterly earnings call where she expected to be the majority shareholder. The room was a vacuum of emotion, filled only by the muffled sounds of traffic on East 42nd Street and the rhythmic clicking of the estate attorney's Waterman exception fountain pen. That attorney, a silver-haired shark named Arthur Sterling who billed $1,800 an hour, began laying out the documents that governed the distribution of a $112 million empire. I felt entirely out of place in my stiff Air Force Service dress uniform, the silver clouds on my epaulets catching the sterile LED overhead lighting, a stark contrast to Leona's calculated elegance. She looked at her Patek Philippe Calatrava, her eyes cold and transactional, as if she were waiting for a flight to Zurich rather than listening to the final wishes of the man who raised us. Every time she glanced toward me, her lip curled just slightly, a silent reminder that in her world, my service was a hobby and my uniform was a costume. I remembered the last time I spoke to my father, a grueling phone call while I was overseeing a fuel delivery at an auxiliary landing field, where he told me that real power isn't given in rank, Cassidy, it's bought in acreage. Now, as Sterling cleared his throat to read the specific allocations of the Wynn Trust, the silence was so absolute I could hear the hum of the HVAC system struggling against the New York winter. Leona leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to claim what she believed was hers by right of ambition, while I simply stood there, a soldier in a room full of scavengers, wondering if my father had left me anything more than the bitter memory of his disapproval. The tension was a physical weight, thick enough to choke the breath out of you, as we waited to see how much a lifetime of resentment was actually worth in cold, hard currency. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why Leona looked at me with such filtered venom, you have to understand the hierarchy of the Wynn household, where the golden child wasn't the one who served her country, but the one who could bill the most hours before midnight. Now let me take you back to the moment the seal on the mahogany-grained envelope was finally broken. The distribution of the Wynn estate was not a reading of a will so much as it was a surgical strike designed to sever my ties to the family legacy with the cold precision of a scalpel. Arthur Sterling adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and began reciting the figures that defined my sister's triumph, naming Leona as the primary executor and the sole beneficiary of the crown jewels of our father's empire. She sat there, her spine as straight as a skyscraper, as she officially inherited the 4,500-square-foot penthouse on Park Avenue with its unobstructed views of Central Park and its 24-hour white-glove doorman service, a property currently appraised at $28 million. Along with the real estate, she was handed the keys to the diversified investment portfolios, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the primary family holdings that generated more passive income in a single month than I earned in 3 years of hazardous duty pay. I stood at the edge of the mahogany table, my hands clasped behind my back in a parade rest that felt increasingly like a defense mechanism, watching as the man who spent his life accumulating wealth decided that 7 years of my life spent in the dust of overseas deployments meant nothing. I was the daughter who took emergency leave to sit by our mother's bedside during her final 6 months of grueling chemotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering, changing her 4 bags and whispering stories to her while Leona was busy closing a $40 million acquisition in Singapore. I was the one who felt the heat of the fever and the cold of the grief. Yet as Sterling reached for the final item, he didn't pull out a deed or a certified check for my name. Instead, he slid a single weathered manila envelope across the polished wood toward me, its edges frayed and its weight insultingly light. Inside there was no inheritance, no trust fund, and no acknowledgement of my sacrifice. There was only a vintage, tarnished Korean War challenge coin and a grainy, yellowing photograph from 1975 showing a much younger James when standing in front of a half-finished construction site in Queens. Leona leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair, her fingers tipped with a $60 midnight blue manicure, and let out a soft, rhythmic tap against the table that sounded like a funeral drum. She looked at the coin and then at my uniform, a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth that was more poisonous than any chemical weapon I'd ever been trained to identify. "He admired your discipline, Cassidy," she said, her voice dripping with a calculated, patronizing sweetness that made my blood run cold. "He figured you didn't actually need the money or the assets since the government feeds you and provides your housing, so he decided to leave the heavy lifting of the estate to someone who understands the value of a dollar." The injustice of it felt like a physical blow to the chest. A reminder that in the hypercapitalist theology of the Wynn family, caretaking was a weakness and service was a character flaw. I looked at the photograph of the man who had just effectively disowned me from his grave, his eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses, realizing that to him, I was just a ghost in a flight suit while Leona was the living, breathing monument to his greed. I gripped the challenge coin so hard the metal bit into my palm, the cold ridges of the engraving a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the Hyatt's climate-controlled air. It wasn't about the money, though $112 million is a life-changing sum for anyone living on a captain's salary. It was about the absolute erasure of my place in this family. As Leona began discussing the tax implications of her new $20 million stock options with Sterling, ignoring me as if I were a piece of furniture, I realized that the man who raised us had used his final act on Earth to ensure that his favorite child remained on top of the world while his disappointment remained in the dirt. Family isn't supposed to be a balance sheet, but in this room my net worth had just been calculated as 0. The betrayal deepened at Lisbon International Airport, Gate B12, where the sterile hum of the terminal and the distant whine of jet engines served as the backdrop for my sister's final, devastating move. Leona had insisted on us traveling together on Skybridge Flight 3072 to Denver for the final estate settlement, booking us into business class under the guise of maintaining family optics for the board of directors and the press who still followed the Wynn name. As we sat in the executive lounge, the smell of expensive floor wax and overpriced catering filling the air, Leona sat across from me in a sleek, ivory silk blouse that probably cost more than a month of my base pay. She took a slow, deliberate sip from a $12 glass of chilled Chardonnay, the condensation trailing down the crystal as she watched me with a gaze that was entirely devoid of sisterly affection. Without a hint of hesitation, she dropped a bombshell that shattered whatever remained of our relationship, calmly explaining that she had utilized her extensive legal connections and a series of back-channel favors to obtain and leak my confidential military psychological evaluation from my post-Syria deployment. This wasn't just a breach of privacy. It was a tactical strike designed to trigger a specific mental health clause buried deep within the fine print of our father's secondary trust, a clause that effectively disinherited me from even the smallest residual funds or the minor properties that were supposed to be my safety net. The evaluation, which documented the standard high-stress processing of a combat zone logistics officer, was now being used as a weapon to paint me as clinically unfit to manage any portion of the family legacy. "It is not personal, Cass," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as the marble tiles beneath our feet, as she adjusted her gold Cartier love bracelet with a practiced flick of her wrist. She looked at me not as a sibling who had just lost a father, but as a liability to be liquidated, explaining that her actions were strictly about protecting the Wynn brand from someone who she deemed unstable. The sheer audacity of her using my service and the mental toll of a war zone against me felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs, making the recycled air of the airport feel thin and suffocating. I looked down at my hands, which had coordinated the movement of millions of dollars in equipment under fire, now being told they were too dangerous to hold a fraction of my own inheritance. Leona checked her Patek Philippe again, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just committed a professional and personal execution of my character in the middle of a public terminal. She didn't see the irony in the fact that while I was monitoring supply lines in the heat of a desert, she was back home studying the legal loopholes that would allow her to rob me of my dignity. The contrast between my life of service and her life of acquisition had never been more apparent than in that moment at Gate B12, where the price of my loyalty was being traded for her total control of the estate. Every word she spoke was a calculated brick in the wall she was building between me and the life I thought I was returning to, leaving me standing in a business-class lounge with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing realization that to my own sister, I was just a threat to be neutralized. Now, as the gate agent announced the boarding for Group A, I felt the cold realization that my father's empire wasn't just built on real estate, but on a foundation of ruthless exclusion that Leona had mastered far better than I ever could. Family isn't a bond of blood when the person sharing your DNA is the one holding the knife to your career and your future. Cruising at 32,000 feet over the dark, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the emotional vacuum between me and my sister was more dangerous than the thin, freezing air screaming past the fuselage of our Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Leona sat ensconced in seat 14A, the premium leather of the business-class pod cradling her like a throne, while she continued her relentless verbal assault on the life I had built for myself over the last 7 years. She tilted her head back, a mocking glint in her eyes as she dismissed my entire career as nothing more than playing with joysticks in a glorified sandbox, laughing as she called me a toy soldier who was too soft for the real world of Manhattan real estate. I sat in 14C, my body held in a rigid, disciplined silence that I had learned in the harshest environments on Earth, my fingers white-knuckled as they gripped my father's vintage Korean War Challenge coin inside my pocket. The ridges of the tarnished brass bit into my skin, a grounding pain that kept me from reacting to the vitriol spilling from her perfectly glossed lips. I realized then that Leona hadn't just climbed the family ladder with the ambition of a conqueror. She had systematically set the entire structure on fire while I was still standing on the top rungs, ensuring that there would be nothing left for me to return to. The cabin of Skybridge Flight 3072 was a curated luxury bubble, a high-altitude sanctuary of Bose noise-canceling headphones, heated designer cashmere blankets, and the soft, ambient glow of the individual reading lights that cost more to maintain than my monthly housing allowance. The hum of the twin General Electric GX engines was a steady, rhythmic drone that usually provided a sense of security, but in the presence of my sister's malice, it felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. Leona reached for her refill of Chardonnay, her movements fluid and entitled, as she continued to explain how my military psychological evaluation was the final nail in the coffin of my inheritance, a move she viewed as a brilliant legal maneuver rather than a sisterly betrayal. She was so insulated by her wealth and her perceived superiority that she didn't notice the subtle change in the aircraft's vibration or the way the flight attendants began to move toward their jump seats with a sudden, practiced urgency. Then, without warning, the first jolt of what the pilot would later call minor turbulence slammed into the airframe, a violent shudder that felt like a giant hand had swatted the plane from the sky. The cabin lights flickered for a fraction of a second as the 787 dropped 50 feet in a heart-stopping lurch, causing the crystal glass in Leona's hand to fly upward before splashing its contents directly onto her $1,200 ivory silk blouse. The cold, acidic wine soaked into the delicate fabric instantly, creating a jagged, ugly stain that bloomed across her chest like a wound, ruining the carefully curated image of perfection she worked so hard to maintain. For a moment, the high-powered Manhattan attorney was silenced by the physical reality of a world she couldn't control, her eyes wide with a flicker of genuine, unscripted fear as she looked down at the wreckage of her outfit. I didn't move, I didn't offer a napkin, and I certainly didn't offer comfort. I simply sat there in the sudden, heavy silence of the cabin, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that comes when the environment turns hostile. In the pressurized luxury of the Atlantic crossing, the stain on her silk was the first crack in her armor, a reminder that no matter how many millions you inherit, you are still subject to the laws of physics and the whims of a turbulent sky. But I'm getting ahead of myself because that first jolt was merely the preamble to a much deeper descent into the chaos that was about to redefine what family loyalty truly meant at 600 miles per hour. Now, as the fasten seatbelt sign chimed with an ominous double-pitched ring, I watched Leona fumble with her silk-wrapped buttons, her hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The routine transatlantic flight from Lisbon to Denver dissolved into a visceral nightmare in a fraction of a second when a sharp metallic mechanical pop echoed through the pressurized hull from the direction of the right wing, followed immediately by the sickening high-pitched whine of metal shearing against metal. Engine 2 had suffered a catastrophic uncontained failure, and within heartbeats, the recycled air pouring through the overhead vents was replaced by the acrid, stinging smell of ozone and burnt plastic that signaled an electrical surge through the aircraft's nervous system. The main cabin lights of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner flickered twice and then died completely, plunging the business-class sanctuary into a tomb-like darkness that was instantly replaced by the eerie, pulsing red glow of the emergency LED floor strips. While Leona began to hyperventilate in seat 14A, her voice rising in a shrill, entitled panic as she shrieked about budget airline maintenance and threatened to sue the carrier before we had even leveled out, my own military training, forged over 1,400 flight hours in the most hostile airspaces on the planet, took absolute control of my nervous system. I didn't scream or fumble for a phone. Instead, I felt the subtle, terrifying shift in the fuselage's vibration, a rhythmic shuddering that told me the airframe was fighting against a massive asymmetrical drag. I noticed the terrifying heavy silence from the cockpit, a lack of any immediate communication that suggested the pilots were currently wrestling with a complete loss of flight control surfaces or a total hydraulic failure. The flight attendants, who only moments ago had been pouring vintage champagne with practiced, effortless smiles, now stood frozen in the aisles, their faces transformed into pale masks of pure, unadulterated terror as they gripped the edges of the seat shells for stability. I could hear the overhead bins groaning under the stress of the descent, the sound of 1,000 suitcases shifting like gravel in a landslide, while Leona's expensive Chardonnay continued to drip from her ruined silk blouse onto the Italian leather upholstery. My name is Cassidy Wynn, and while my sister spent her life mastering the art of the verbal execution, I had spent mine mastering the art of survival in a cockpit at 30,000 feet, and I knew that the vibration we were feeling wasn't just turbulence, but the final warning of a dying machine. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the cabin, making the high-end interior look like a scene from a fever dream, and for the first time in my life, I saw the cracks in Leona's impenetrable armor as she realized that her $40 million portfolio couldn't buy her a single extra second of altitude. I reached out and grabbed the oxygen mask that had just deployed from the ceiling with a plastic snap, my movements fluid and devoid of the paralysis that was gripping everyone else in business class. I looked at the grainy 1975 photo of my father that I still held in my left hand, the man who thought I was just a toy soldier, and I realized that the discipline he mocked was the only thing currently standing between us and the cold Atlantic graveyard below. Now, as the aircraft banked sharply to the right and the nose began to dip toward the horizon, the reality of our situation settled into my bones with the weight of a lead shroud. There was no corporate loophole to exploit here, no legal motion to file, and no daddy to bail Leona out of the consequences of physics. The roar of the wind against the compromised wing was a deafening, chaotic symphony that drowned out her frantic sobbing, and as I tightened my seatbelt until it bruised my hips, I knew that the dropout was the only person on this flight who knew exactly how much time we had left before we hit the water. Family isn't about who inherits the most. Family is who knows how to keep you breathing when the engines stop turning. Absolute chaos erupted within the pressurized confines of the business-class cabin as the yellow oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments with a sharp, synchronized hiss that sounded like a collective intake of breath from the aircraft itself. The Boeing 787 banked hard to the left, the aerodynamic drag from the dead engine pulling us into a terrifying spiral as we began losing altitude at a staggering rate of 2,000 feet per minute according to the internal clock of my own racing pulse. A flight attendant, her hair disheveled and her professional composure completely shattered, stumbled through the heavy velvet curtain separating the galley from the seating area, sobbing hysterically that the captain had been incapacitated by a sudden, massive medical emergency and that the first officer was becoming dangerously overwhelmed by the cascading system failures. Leona, who was currently paralyzed by a primal fear that no amount of litigation could resolve, screamed at the trembling attendant to stop crying and find a real pilot, her voice cracking with an entitlement that had finally met its match in the laws of physics. She turned her venomous gaze toward me, her face pale and glistening with sweat as she hurled one last desperate insult, shouting that someone with my history of PTSD and combat-related trauma had no business moving toward the cockpit, but I was already unbuckling my 5-point harness with the fluid muscle memory precision of a seasoned aviator. I ignored her completely, my mind already shifting into a cold, analytical state of situational awareness that pushed the noise of her panic into the background as I forced my way past the frantic passengers and through the reinforced security door. Stepping into the flight deck was like entering a digital forest of flashing red warning lights and blaring master caution horns, a sensory overload that would have broken anyone without my 1,400 hours of military flight experience. The first officer was white-knuckled, his hands shaking as he wrestled with the side stick, while the captain lay slumped over the pedestal, his headset askew and his breathing shallow. The glass cockpit displays were a chaotic mosaic of amber and red alerts, indicating a total loss of the right-side hydraulic system and a critical engine fire that had already compromised the wing's structural integrity. I didn't ask for permission and I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped over the center pedestal, my boots gripping the floor with a stability that my sister would never understand, and I reached for the spare headset while my eyes scanned the primary flight display. The smell of ozone was even thicker here, a sharp, metallic tang that signaled the imminent failure of the remaining avionics. But as I adjusted the throttle for the functioning engine, I felt a calm that I hadn't known since my last mission over the Mediterranean. My sister thought I was a dropout who played with joysticks, but as the ground proximity warning system began its rhythmic electronic chanting of sync rate, I knew that my discipline was the only thing that could prevent this $112 million family tragedy from ending in a ball of fire on the surface of the Atlantic. I sat in the captain's seat, the leather warm from the man who had just collapsed, and I felt the weight of the 300 souls behind me, including the sister who had just tried to ruin my life. Real power isn't found in a boardroom or a bank account. Real power is the ability to hold a plummeting 300-ton machine steady when everyone else is screaming for a miracle they didn't earn. Family is who keeps the nose of the plane above the horizon when the world is trying to pull you down. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 787-9 Dreamliner, the environment was a claustrophobic chamber of high-frequency alarms and the sharp, metallic tang of an electrical fire that threatened to overwhelm the oxygen scrubbers. First Officer Stokes, a man whose professional veneer had completely dissolved into a state of catatonic shock, was hyperventilating so violently that his chest hit the control yoke in a rhythmic, frantic thud that sent erratic inputs to the flight computer. I didn't ask for permission and I didn't wait for a formal handover of the controls. I stepped into the command vacuum with the cold, calculated aggression of a veteran logistics and flight officer who had spent 1,400 hours navigating the jagged skylines of conflict zones. I seized the quick-dawn oxygen mask from its housing, the rubber sealing against my face with a sharp hiss of life-saving pressure, and I clipped the 5-point harness over my military dress uniform until the webbing bit into my shoulders, grounding me in the pilot's seat. U.S. Air Force active, Captain Cassidy Wynn, cleared for multi-engine and heavy transport. I barked over the intercom, my voice a jagged contrast to the melodic chimes of the failing master caution system. The first officer looked at me with pupils dilated to the size of pinheads, his hands shaking so uncontrollably on the yoke that I had to physically pry his fingers back to take the stick. The aircraft was no longer a marvel of modern engineering. It was a wounded 300-ton beast screaming through the thin atmosphere as the secondary hydraulic system bled out, leaving the flight surfaces sluggish and unresponsive. Through the reinforced windshield, the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a scenic backdrop for a business-class journey, but a dark, hungry gray expanse of white-capped swells that looked ready to swallow us whole. I felt the immense, crushing weight of 300 lives resting on my fingertips, the very same lives that my sister Leona had referred to as collateral damage in her pursuit of the Wynn estate just minutes earlier in the cabin. The primary flight display was a blur of red tape and descending numbers, showing our airspeed dropping toward a critical stall as I fought to trim the aircraft against the massive asymmetrical drag of the dead number 2 engine. I reached for the center pedestal, my fingers moving with a muscle memory that bypassed my conscious mind, as I began running the uncontained engine failure and emergency descent checklists that I knew by heart from a dozen simulated disasters at Ramstein. Every shudder of the airframe felt like a personal insult from the man who had left me a copper coin and a grainy photo, a man who believed his boardroom battles were more significant than the literal life-and-death struggle currently playing out at 500 miles per hour. My sister was somewhere behind that cockpit door, likely clutching her ruined silk blouse and her $1 million legal briefs, completely unaware that her survival now depended entirely on the dropout who traded a law degree for a flight suit. I shoved the throttle for the remaining engine forward, feeling the airframe groan under the stress of the sudden thrust, and I forced the nose down to maintain the airspeed we needed to keep from falling out of the sky. In this pressurized tomb of flashing LEDs and screaming servos, the hierarchy of the Wynn family had been permanently inverted. Family isn't the name on a skyscraper or the signature on a trust fund. Family is the steady hand that holds the line when the engines fail and the horizon starts to spin. Now, as the GPWS voice began to chant its rhythmic warning of terrain, pull up, I realized that I wasn't just flying a plane, I was reclaiming the dignity that Leona and my father had spent a lifetime trying to strip away. The struggle wasn't just with the controls, but with the realization that the only person capable of saving the Wynn legacy was the one they had deemed unworthy of it. Leona, driven by a toxic cocktail of primal terror and an pathological need for absolute control, actually attempted to breach the cockpit door to stop me, her voice a jagged glass shard cutting through the roar of the depressurizing cabin as she shrieked that I wasn't legally certified for commercial flight and that my hero complex was going to be the death of everyone on board. She was banging on the reinforced security panel, her expensive rings clattering against the metal as she screamed about liability and FAA regulations, completely unable to comprehend that a $100 million legal pedigree meant nothing to a Boeing 787 that was currently falling out of the sky at 300 knots. I didn't even turn around to acknowledge the woman who had spent the last decade trying to erase my existence. Instead, I reached out with a steady hand and engaged the cockpit deadbolt, the mechanical thud finally silencing her venomous interruptions and leaving me alone with the dying systems of the aircraft. My world had narrowed down to the glowing primary flight display and the 9,000-foot strip of gray concrete at McLaren Field, a tiny wind-swept diversion airstrip in Newfoundland that was our only hope of surviving the next 6 minutes. The margin for error was non-existent because this airframe was still heavy with nearly 80,000 pounds of Jet A1 fuel intended for a transatlantic crossing, and the telemetry showed we were leaking propellant from the damaged right wing at a catastrophic rate of 40 pounds per minute. I could feel the sluggishness in the side stick as the hydraulic pressure in system center flickered between yellow and red, a clear indication that the control surfaces were barely responding to my inputs as I fought to align our descent path with the remote Canadian coastline. The 787 was too fast, its kinetic energy a lethal liability, and as the automated voice of the flight computer began its rhythmic electronic countdown of our remaining altitude, I realized that I was piloting a flying fuel tank that was never designed to land on a runway this short or this primitive. Outside the windscreen, the dark, jagged cliffs of Newfoundland rose up through the fog like the teeth of a predator, and the smell of ozone in the cockpit grew thicker as the remaining electronics struggled to stay online against the surging current from the backup generators. I ignored the phantom echoes of my father's voice telling me I was a failure and my sister's muffled screams from behind the door, focusing every ounce of my military training into the tactile feedback of the controls and the precise calculation of our glide slope. I was no longer the daughter who was passed over in a will or the sister who was mocked for her service. I was the only barrier between 300 innocent souls and a localized inferno on a strip of North Atlantic tundra. Every second felt like an eternity as I adjusted the flaps to their maximum setting, feeling the airframe groan and shudder under the immense stress of the drag, while the airspeed indicator hovered dangerously close to the stall margin. I knew that if I touched down even 50 feet long or 10 knots too fast, the landing gear would collapse and the entire fuselage would disintegrate into the surrounding pine forest. But as the landing lights finally cut through the mist and illuminated the cracked, weathered surface of McLaren Field, a sense of absolute icy clarity settled over me that no amount of inheritance could ever buy. Real dignity isn't found in the fine print of a secondary trust or the square footage of a Manhattan penthouse. It is found in the moment you realize you are the only one capable of holding the world together when it's trying to tear itself apart. Family is who stays at the controls when the engines go dark and the horizon starts to scream. Now, as the runway threshold expanded to fill my field of vision, I gripped the throttles and prepared to execute the most expensive landing of my life. The descent toward the jagged, fog-shrouded coastline of Newfoundland was no longer a flight but a desperate, bone-jarring battle against the cold laws of physics that governed a 300-ton machine stripped of its primary power and grace. My hands were locked onto the side stick with a white-knuckled intensity as I manually overrode the glitching autopilot system, which was frantically trying to compensate for the asymmetrical drag by throwing us into a terminal spin that would have disintegrated the airframe before we even touched the water. I was forced to manage a harrowing deadstick glide approach, a maneuver usually reserved for light gliders or emergency simulator drills. Yet here I was wrestling with the sluggish, unresponsive flight surfaces of a wide-body Boeing 787 while the altimeter spun backward with terrifying velocity. As the cockpit windows filled with the sight of the dark, rain-slicked concrete of McLaren Field, I reached the 500-foot mark and made the gut-wrenching decision to cut the remaining engines thrust early to prevent a fatal bounce and cartwheel scenario on a runway that was never designed to absorb this much kinetic energy. The synthetic, haunting voice of the onboard computer began to scream stall imminent in my ear, a rhythmic electronic death knell that vibrated through my headset and into my very skull as the wings fought to find lift in the thin, turbulent air. Behind the reinforced cockpit door, 300 passengers were tucked into the brace position, their heads buried in their laps as they prayed to whatever gods they still believed in, while the cabin was filled with the sound of groaning metal and the frantic weeping of the terrified. Leona was huddled in seat 14A, her expensive ivory silk blouse stained with wine and her manicured fingers digging into the leather armrests, finally realizing in a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity that her prestigious law degree and her $100 million inheritance could not negotiate, litigate, or bribe the force of gravity. She was no longer the high-powered Manhattan attorney or the primary executor of a real estate empire. She was simply a passenger whose entire existence depended on the sister she had spent a lifetime belittling as a mere dropout playing with joysticks. I felt the ground effect take hold as we leveled out over the threshold, the aircraft floating for a terrifying, weightless second before I forced the nose down, aiming for the very first inch of available concrete to give us every possible foot of stopping distance. The smell of ozone and hydraulic fluid was suffocating, and the vibrations coming through the floorboards told me the landing gear was under immense structural stress that threatened to shear the struts right off the wing. My name is Cassidy Wynn, and as the stall warning shifted into the continuous guttural roar of the tires finally making contact with the earth, I realized that the discipline my father mocked was the only currency that actually mattered in the middle of a catastrophe. The impact was a violent, teeth-rattling slam that sent a shockwave through my spine, followed immediately by the desperate, screaming howl of the emergency brakes and the deployment of the spoilers as I fought to keep the wounded beast from veering into the surrounding forest. Every muscle in my body was strained to the breaking point as I stood on the rudder pedals, feeling the heat of the friction burning through the soles of my boots while the end of the runway rushed toward us with the speed of a freight train. In that moment of terminal velocity and smoking rubber, the hierarchy of the Wynn family was finally, irrevocably shattered, leaving only the truth that family isn't the person who shares your blood, but the person who has the strength to hold the line when the world falls apart. I gripped the controls until the plane finally shuddered to a bone-crushing halt just yards from the treeline, the silence that followed being the loudest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The landing was a violent, bone-shattering collision between 300 tons of screaming metal and the unyielding reality of the North Atlantic permafrost as the tires of the Boeing 787 hit the rain-slicked tarmac at a lethal 160 knots. I stood on the manual brakes with every ounce of strength in my legs, feeling the searing heat of the friction telegraphing through the floorboards and into the soles of my boots while the entire fuselage groaned and buckled under a deceleration force that threatened to tear the landing gear straight through the wings. The screech of the rubber against the weathered concrete was a high-pitched metallic wail that drowned out the world, a sound of pure mechanical agony that only ceased when the nose of the aircraft finally dipped and came to a shuddering, lurching halt exactly 42 feet from the crumbling edge of a gravel embankment. An absolute heavy silence fell over the cabin for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, a vacuum of sound so profound it made my ears ring, before it was shattered by a tidal wave of hysterical sobbing, frantic prayers, and the raw, guttural cheers of 300 people who had just stared into the abyss and been pulled back. I sat motionless in the pilot's seat, my chest heaving against the restraints of the 5-point harness while my hands continued to vibrate with a phantom resonance from the control yoke, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins like liquid fire. On the glare shield of the dashboard, reflecting the dim gray light of the Newfoundland mist, sat my father's tarnished Korean War Challenge coin, the only thing he had deemed me worthy of inheriting. I looked at that piece of brass and realized that while Leona had inherited the $40 million portfolios in the Park Avenue penthouses, I had inherited the one thing my father never learned how to value, the ability to remain standing when everything else falls apart. I had just used the very discipline and military training my sister mocked as a toy soldier's hobby to save the life of the person who had spent the last 72 hours systematically trying to destroy my future. The cockpit door, which I had deadbolted against her venomous shrieks, remained a silent barrier between the chaos of the cabin and the icy clarity of the flight deck, a physical manifestation of the boundary I had finally drawn between my life of service and their life of greed. I could hear the muffled sound of Leona's voice from the other side, no longer sharp with legal threats or entitled demands, but broken and small, stripped of the armor that wealth provides when gravity becomes the only judge. My name is Cassidy Wynn, and as I reached out to flip the final master kill switches and silence the warning horns, I understood that the true Wynn legacy wasn't found in a ledger or a leaked psychological evaluation, but in the calloused hands that held a steady course through a storm. The contrast between my sister's calculated cruelty and the raw reality of this survival made the $112 million she fought for seem like a handful of dust in the wind. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins. Family is the person who keeps their hand on the throttle and their eyes on the horizon when the engines fail and the world begins to scream. I didn't need the penthouse or the offshore accounts to know exactly who I was, and as the emergency slides began to deploy with a series of muffled thuds, I realized that the greatest inheritance I ever received was the strength to walk away from a wreckage I didn't cause. Now, as the first scent of fresh, cold Canadian air filtered into the cockpit, I picked up the challenge coin and slipped it into my pocket, the cold metal a final, silent weight against my thigh. Finality isn't a signature on a will. Finality is the moment the wheels stop spinning and you realize you're still breathing. Standing on the windswept tarmac of McLaren Field as the strobe lights of Canadian emergency vehicles sliced through the thick Atlantic fog, I felt the atmospheric pressure of my entire life shift with the finality of a tectonic plate settling into place. The air was frigid, tasting of salt and high-octane fuel, but the heat radiating from the swarming fire crews and the idling engines of the rescue vehicles created a surreal high-stakes sanctuary. First Officer Stokes, his uniform shirt translucent with cold sweat and his professional composure replaced by a raw human vulnerability, threw his arms around me in a crushing embrace, his voice cracking as he called me a miracle worker in front of the local paramedics. The passengers who had been praying for their lives minutes ago began to spill out of the emergency slides and down the mobile stair units, their terror transforming into a collective euphoric reverence that I had never experienced in a decade of military service. A man in a salt-stained Denver Nuggets hoodie, clutching his young daughter so tightly their knuckles were white, stopped in his tracks when he saw me, his eyes brimming with a silent, profound gratitude that made his daughter reach out to touch the silver pilot's wings pinned to my flight suit as if I were a deity descended from the clouds. In the center of this burgeoning circle of survivors, Leona finally stepped off the last riser of the mobile stairs, her $3,000 Max Mara blazer wrinkled beyond repair and her ivory silk blouse clinging to her skin in a jagged, wine-stained mess that made her look small and fragile for the first time in 34 years. She tried to reclaim her practiced authority, her voice rising in a shrill, habitual command as she attempted to berate the ground crew about the location of her designer Tumi luggage and the legal liability of the airline, but the power of her bank account had evaporated the moment we touched the concrete. No one was listening to the high-powered Manhattan attorney anymore. The flight attendants who had spent the last 6 hours catering to her every whim, deliberately ignored her demands and instead formed a somber, respectful line to shake my hand and offer quiet words of thanks. The hierarchy of the Wynn Empire had been utterly dismantled by the sheer weight of survival, leaving Leona standing on the periphery of a miracle she couldn't buy and a respect she hadn't earned. I watched her realize that the psychological evaluation she had leaked to disinherit me was now a meaningless scrap of paper compared to the flight data recorder that would tell the story of how the dropout saved 300 souls. My father had built his world on the idea that power was a deed you held in your hand, but as I stood on that freezing runway surrounded by the people I had kept alive, I knew that real power was the quiet, steady discipline of the one who doesn't blink when the world goes dark. Leona reached out toward me, perhaps to apologize or perhaps to exert one last legal threat, but I simply turned my back on her and walked toward the warmth of the hangar, the vintage Korean War coin heavy and solid in my pocket. Family isn't the name engraved on a skyscraper. Family is the person who stands between you and the end of the world without asking for a receipt. Now, as the sirens faded into the distance and the sun began to struggle through the Newfoundland mist, I realized that I didn't need a single cent of the $112 million to be the richest person on that tarmac. Finality isn't the reading of a will, but the moment you realize you owe nothing to the ghosts of your past. The aftermath of the descent into Newfoundland became the final, unceremonious public execution of Leona's carefully constructed ego as the digital world and the aviation industry collided to dismantle her narrative in a matter of hours. Within 48 hours of the wheels touching the tarmac at McLaren Field, the CEO of Skybridge Airways personally called my encrypted military line at Ramstein Air Base, his voice thick with a genuine, trembling gratitude that no amount of corporate PR could fake, while the story of the soldier pilot who bypassed a catastrophic engine failure went viral across every major news network from CNN to the BBC. When Arthur Sterling, the high-priced estate attorney who had originally helped Leona weaponize my medical records, received the black box telemetry and the witness statements regarding Leona's frantic, dangerous attempts to physically block me from entering the cockpit, the mental health clause she had relied upon was effectively shredded in both the court of law and the court of public opinion. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. The very psychological evaluation she leaked to prove I was unstable became the ultimate evidence of my resilience, as the flight data proved that my combat-hardened reflexes were the only reason 300 people weren't currently at the bottom of the Atlantic. I returned to my post in Germany, stepping off a C-17 transport plane not as the disgraced dropout or the disinherited daughter, but as a hero whose name was being whispered with reverence by colonels and airmen alike. I sat in my austere barracks room, the gray German morning light filtering through the reinforced glass, and I looked at the vintage Korean War Challenge coin resting on my metal desk next to a steaming mug of black coffee. I realized then that my father, in his own twisted hypermasculine way, had understood exactly what he was doing when he left me that tarnished piece of brass instead of a liquid asset or a deed to a penthouse. He knew that Leona was built for the sunshine of a bull market, but I was forged for the darkness of a terminal velocity stall, and he had left me the only tool that mattered when the world finally stopped making sense. I opened my laptop and composed one final brief email to my sister, who was currently facing a mountain of litigation from the airline and a board of directors that viewed her as a catastrophic liability to the Wynn brand. I didn't write a manifesto or a plea for reconciliation. I simply attached a high-resolution photo of the challenge coin, its tarnished surface gleaming with a quiet, undeniable strength, and typed a single paragraph that had been simmering in my soul since the moment we hit the ground. Dad knew I didn't need his money, Leona, because he knew that I was the only one in this family who could actually handle the crash when it finally came. I hit send and felt the last tether to the $112 million empire snap with a satisfying, silent finality that felt better than any inheritance check ever could. Real wealth isn't what you can lose in a market crash or a legal battle. It is the absolute certainty of who you are when the engines die and the horizon starts to tilt. Family is often the fire that tries to consume you, but for those of us who survive the burn, the wreckage is where we finally find our wings. As I closed the laptop and walked toward the flight line for my morning shift, I knew that the Wynn legacy didn't belong to the sister in the silk blouse, but to the soldier who knew how to bring the world home safely. Finality isn't the end of a story. It is the beginning of a life where you no longer have to prove your worth to people who only value the price of the suit you're wearing. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays at the controls until the very end.